The ship was dying, and Jake knew it in his bones as metal screamed around him and warning lights painted. The cockpit read like blood on snow, and he pulled hard on the controls. Fighting gravity, fighting fate, fighting the inevitable end that waited. Below, where trees the size of mountains reached up with branches that glowed soft blue in the gathering dark, and he thought about his crew about. Lisa in the back running calculations even now about Troy trying to patch the engines, about Kate. Giving orders that nobody could follow anymore, because there was no saving the Avalon now, there was only the crash, and maybe if he was good enough. If he was lucky enough, there might be survival after the impact, threw him forward against the restraints. Hard enough to crack ribs, hard enough to taste blood, and then there was silence. Broken only by the hiss of escaping air, and the groan of settling metal and the sound of his own breathing too loud in his ears, and he hung there for a moment suspended. Between then and now, between the pilot he had been and whatever he would become next, and then training took over, and he was moving. Checking systems, checking crew, checking for threats in this alien world that had reached up and swallowed them. Holissa was already out of her seat when he found her in the science bay. Surrounded by broken equipment and shattered samples, but her hands were steady as she checked readings on a handheld scanner, and she looked up at him with eyes that were calm despite everything and said, "The air is breathable, Jake. The gravity's 0.9 standard, and there is something in the atmosphere that our sensors cannot identify. Something that makes the instruments." Sink Troy had a gash across his forehead. That bled freely, but he waved away concern as he worked to seal the hull breach in engineering in his hands. Moved with the practiced ease of someone who had fixed 1,000 broken things in wood. Fix 1,000 more, and he muttered numbers. Under his breath, calculating what they had left, what they could salvage, what might keep them alive long enough to matter, and Jake saw the answer in his eyes, and it was not enough, not nearly enough. Kate found them all in the cargo bay where the main airlock still functioned, and she had her sidearm, drawn, not pointed at anything, just ready, and her jaw was set in that way that meant she was thinking tactically, thinking about threats, thinking about survival, and she said, "We have maybe 3 days of emergency rations, the beacon is damaged beyond repair, and we are 600 light-years from the nearest human outpost." And Jake heard what she did not say, which was that they were dead already, they just had not stopped moving yet. They went out together into the twilight forest, and the trees were like nothing Jake had ever seen. Trunks wider than houses, bark that pulsed with veins of light that ran like rivers through wood, and the air smelled of electricity and growing things. And something else, something ancient and aware. And Lisa kept scanning, kept recording, kept being a scientist, even at the end of everything. And Troy gathered materials, thinking about shelter, thinking about tools, and Kate watched the shadows with her weapon ready. The elves came at sunset when the light turned the color of copper and dreams, and they emerged from between the trees like they had always been there, like they were part of the forest itself, and they were tall, so tall that Jake had to tilt his head back to meet their eyes, and those eyes were like cut gems that caught the light and threw it back in colors that had no names, and they wore armor that seemed grown rather than forged, all curves and organic lines and living metal. There were dozens of them, and they moved with a grace that made Jake feel clumsy and crude, and at their center was a woman who could only be royalty because she wore authority like a cloak, and beside her was something that made his breath catch in his throat because it was a dragon scaled in colors that shifted like oil on water, with eyes that burned with intelligence older than mountains. The dragon looked at Jake, and he felt its mind brush against his like a hand passing through smoke, and then there were words in his head, not spoken, but known, and they said, "You are far from home, little human." And he did not know how to answer, because yes, he was far from home. Farther than he had ever imagined being, and the dragon made a sound that might have been laughter. The queen spoke, and her voice was like music played on instruments, made of crystal and starlight, and she said in perfect, unaccented English, "You have arrived at either the perfect moment or the worst possible. Time and I have not yet decided which," and Jake felt the world tilt because she should not know his language, should not know anything about humanity, and yet she spoke like she had been expecting them. Kate stepped forward with her weapon lowered, but not holstered, and she used her command voice and said, I am Commander Kate Sullivan of the human exploration vessel. Avalon, we mean no harm. We are simply travelers who have crashed on your world. And the Queen smiled, and it was not a comforting expression, and she said, I know what you are. I have been listening to your distress calls. I have been watching your ship fall. I have been waiting. She gestured, and the elves parted, and beyond them Jake could see lights in the distance, a city of crystal and metal that rose from the forest floor like a dream made solid. And the Queen said, Come. You will rest, you will eat, and then we will talk about why you are here and what it might cost you to leave. And the dragon looked at Jake with those burning eyes, and he felt examined, weighed, measured, and he did not know if he had passed or failed. They walked through the forest, and Lisa whispered measurements and observations, and Troy studied the elf technology with hungry eyes. And Kate kept her hand near her weapon, and Jake walked beside the Queen because she had positioned herself next to him deliberately, and she said, I am Silvara, and this is Nethes, and we have been fighting a war for longer than your species has. Known how to make fire, the city was impossible, all soaring towers and living walls and streets that glowed with their own light, and there were elves everywhere, but Jake noticed something wrong, something that made his skin prickle, because there were no children, no young ones, only adults with old eyes, and the Queen saw him noticing, and she said, Yes, you see it already. We are a dying people, and that is why you are here, even if you do not know it yet. They were brought to a hall carved from a single massive crystal and given food that tasted like memories and drink that sparkled on the tongue, and Lisa could not stop asking questions, and Troy kept touching things with wonder, and Kate interrogated their hosts politely but firmly, and Jake sat and tried to understand what was happening, tried to fit the pieces together, but they would not align then. The attack came without warning, sirens wailing and elves running to battle stations, and through the crystal walls Jake saw them coming, dark shapes against the darkening sky like locusts made of metal and shadow, and the Queen stood, and her face was grim. And she said, The void has found us again. And Nethes roared, and the sound shook the foundations of the world. Kate was already moving, organizing their small crew into a defensive position, and Troy was asking what they could do. What weapons did they have? And Lisa was scanning the enemy, trying to understand what they were, and Jake found himself running not away, but toward. Because that was what you did when your people were threatened, even if these were not his people, even if this was not his fight. Void machines were like nothing in human records, all wrong angles and impossible geometry, and they moved in perfect synchronization like parts of a single organism. Where they touched the crystal walls, the walls dyed the light, going out like a candle flame in the wind, and the elves fought with weapons that sang and shields that shimmered, but they were being pushed back step by step. Jake saw the Avalon in the distance, saw its broken hull, and had an idea born of desperation and old training, and he grabbed Troy and shouted over the sounds of battle and said, The electromagnetic pulse, the one we used for clearing debris fields. And Troy understood immediately, and they rigged it in the cargo bay with shaking hands and failing light, and the calculations were rough, too rough, but there was no time for precision, only for action, and they set the timer and ran, and Jake hit the trigger, and the pulse went out like the fist of an angry god. Void machines fell from the sky by the hundreds, their coordination shattered, their hive mind disrupted. They hit the ground like rain made of metal, and for a moment there was silence, and then the elves were cheering, and Jake stood there breathing hard, trying to understand what he had just done. Silvara found him in the aftermath, and Nethes coiled around them both like a living wall. And the Queen looked at him with an expression he could not read, and she said, You fight like you have nothing to lose. And he said, We crashed on an alien world 600 light years from home. What exactly do we have to lose? And she smiled and said, Perhaps everything, perhaps the future itself. That night she summoned him alone to her chambers, high in the tallest tower, where the walls were transparent, and showed the battlefield below, still smoking, still burning, and she poured him something that glowed faintly in the cup and said, I must ask you something, and you may hate me for asking, but I must ask anyway, because my people are dying, and you may be the only hope we have left. Jake drank, and it tasted like starlight, like the space between stars, and he said, asking Silvera. Looked out at her dying world and said our people are going extinct not from war but from biology. And we have tried everything and failed, and then you fell from the sky with your... Jake woke to light, filtering through crystal walls, and for a moment, he forgot where he was. Forgot about the crash. Forgot about impossible offers from alien queens. Then it all came rushing back and he lay there staring at the ceiling that pulsed with gentle blue light and thought about the weight of extinction carried in a single question. Lisa found him in the common area. They had been given, and she sat down across from him with 2 cups of something warm that the elves had provided. And she said, "You are thinking about saying yes." And he said, "I do not know what I am thinking." And she said, "That is a lie. You have already decided, you just have not admitted it to yourself yet." She pulled out her scanner and showed him data streams. "And genetic maps?" And she said, "The compatibility is real, Jake. Not perfect, but real. And there is a chance that hybrid children could bypass the genetic damage that has rendered the elves sterile." And he said, "A chance is not a certainty." And she said, "Nothing in biology is certain, but this is better odds than they have had in 3 generations. Kate joined them with Troy behind her, and the commander had her tactical face on the one she wore when making hard decisions, and she said, we need to talk about the bigger picture, about what this means politically, about what Earth will say when they find out." And Jake said, "Earth is 600 light years away, and we may never see it again." And Kate said, "That does not change what this is what it represents." Troy was quieter than usual, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, and he said, "I have been studying their technology, Jake, and it is dying to not just the people, but their entire civilization, and the infrastructure is failing, and the power systems are degrading, and they have maybe 50 years before it all collapses completely, and the void will sweep over them like a wave over sand." Jake said, "So, even if we solve the fertility problem, it might be too late." And Troy nodded and said, "Unless we can help them survive long enough for a new generation to grow up to learn to rebuild. That means fighting, that means staying, that means committing to this world." Instead of hoping for rescues, Silvera sent for him at midday. And he went alone through corridors that hummed with power that was slowly fading, and he saw it now that he was looking the cracks in the crystal. The dimming of lights, the way the elves moved with a weariness that went bone deep, and he understood that this was not a civilization at war. This was a civilization in its final chapter. The Queen was in her war room, surrounded by holographic displays that showed battlefronts and enemy positions and casualty counts that made Jake feel sick, and she dismissed her advisors when he entered, and the room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of failing technology. And she said, "You have questions." And he said, I have 1,000 questions." He asked about the void, about where they came from, what they wanted, and she said, "They are a hive intelligence born from another race that faced extinction, and they chose to upload themselves to machines to live forever in digital consciousness, and something went wrong, and now they consume because consumption is all they know." He asked about the elves, about their history, about how they fell from being a starfaring race to being trapped on a single dying world, and she told him about the long war, about retreat after retreat, about watching worlds burn until only this one remained, and her voice was steady, but her eyes held centuries of griefy. Asked about her, about why she was the one making this offer, and she said, "Because I am the last of the pure bloodline, the last whose genetics are undamaged enough to attempt conception, and if I fail, there is no one else, and the magical bond that ties our people to this world will break, and everything will." And Jake said, "I need guarantees, need medical oversight from Lisa, need time too. Know you as a person, not just as a symbol." And Silvera looked surprised and said, "You would bargain." And he said, "Yes, because if I agree to this, it will not be as a transaction. It will be as a choice made by 2 people who understand what they are doing." She studied him for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, not the careful, diplomatic expression, but something genuine. And she said, "Very well, human, you may court me in your fashion, and I will show you my world, and we will see if we can build something real from this desperate necessity." Over the following weeks, something strange happened, something Jake had not expected, and he found himself actually enjoying Silvera company and she showed him the wonders of her world, the libraries where memories were stored in living crystal, the gardens where plants from 100 dead worlds still grew, the temples where her people sang songs older than human civilization. He taught her about humanity, about their tendency to laugh in the face of impossible odds, about their stubborn refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible, and he showed her human music and human stories, and she listened with a hunger that surprised him, and she said, "Your people are very young, but perhaps that is your strength. You do not know enough to understand when you should give up Troy." And Lisa worked with the elf scientists and engineers, and they found common ground in the universal language of problem solving, and together they began designing hybrid systems that combined human pragmatism with elf elegance, and slowly, carefully, they started to build bridges between technologies that should not have been compatible. Kate spent her time with the elf military commanders, learning their tactics, studying their strategies, and she saw immediately what Jake had seen, that they fought with honor and grace and were losing because the void had no honor, no grace, only numbers and time. And she began teaching them human methods that were crude and brutal and effective. Nethys declared that Jake must undergo the dragon trial, and Silvera tried to argue, but the dragon was firm and said, "If he is to be your mate even temporarily, he must prove himself worthy, and the trial is the only way." And Jake said, "What is the trial?" And Nethys said, "You will seize." Took him to a cave deep beneath the city, where the rock itself pulsed with ancient power, and Nethys coiled around him and said, "I will look into your soul, human, and you will look into mine, and we will see if you can survive what you find." And before Jake could ask what that meant, the world dissolved into fire. He saw the dragon memories, felt them like they were his own, and he experienced the burning of worlds, the death of friends, the slow crushing weight of watching a species slide toward extinction, and he felt Nethys' grief and rage and desperate hope, and it was too much, too vast, too ancient for a human mind to contain. But he also saw Silvera through the dragon eyes, saw her as a child learning to bond with. Nethys saw her as a young queen taking the throne, saw her fighting battles and making impossible choices, and carrying the weight of her people on shoulders that seemed too slender to bear it, and he saw her cry when she thought no one was watching. And then Nethys saw him, saw his memories, his fears, his dreams, his understanding that he was just one person thrown into a situation it's too big for anyone to handle, and the dragon saw his choice to try anyway, to help anyway, because that was what humans did. They helped even when it was hopeless, especially when it was hopeless. Jake woke on the cave floor with Silvera kneeling beside him, and her face was pale, and she said, "No one has ever survived the trial intact. No elf has bonded with a second consciousness in 1,000 years, and no human ever has. But you did, and Jake felt it then. Nethys' presence at the edge of his mind a weight. That was somehow comforting. The dragon said, "You are worthy human, not because you are strong, but because you understand the cost and choose to pay it anyway." And Jake said, "I have not even made my choice yet." And Nethys made that sound that might have been laughter and said, "You made your choice the moment you asked to know her as a person. Now you are just catching up with yourself." They won a major victory 3 weeks later using combined tactics that mixed human guerrilla warfare with elf precision strikes, and a void hive ship that had been thought invincible fell burning from the sky, and for the first time in decades the enemy retreated, and the elves celebrated with a hope Jake had not seen in them before. But Troy found something in the wreckage, something that made his face go gray, and he gathered them all together. Jake, Lisa, Kate, Silvera, and he said, "The void has adapted. They have already developed countermeasures to our tactics, and they are evolving faster than should be possible, and worse, they are targeting the fertility research specifically." Lisa pulled up intercepted communications and said they know about the pregnancy attempt. "They have been monitoring our data streams, and they understand that if the elves regain the ability to reproduce, the war becomes unwinnable for them, and they are assembling a fleet at the system edge, and we have weeks." Maybe Lee Silvara stood very still, and then she said, "I am pregnant," and the room went silent, and Jake felt his heart stop and restart, and she said, "It happened last week. The initial tests are positive, but it is early too." early to know if it will hold, and Lisa immediately started running scans and her face was troubled. The doctor said the embryo is viable. But there are complications. The genetic incompatibilities we feared are manifesting, and Svilvera's immune system is starting to reject the hybrid cells, and without intervention, she will miscarry within days. And Jake said, "What kind of intervention?" And Lisa said, "The kind that requires power, massive amounts of power." The sky turned black with enemy ships, and Jake felt the bonding process tear at his mind like hooks in flesh, and Silvera was screaming beside him, not from pain but from fury, and she said, "We are not ready." And Nethys roared and said, "Then we fight." Anyway, because there is no other choice through the mental link, Jake could feel the dragon rage, could feel Silvera. Desperation could feel the reactor power building like a star going nova, and he pushed through the pain and said, "How do we do this?" And the dragon said, "Trust me, trust her, trust yourself, and let go half transformed, caught between human and something more." Jake felt his body move without conscious thought, and he was running with Silvera beside him, and Nethys above them, and the dragon was crackling with nuclear fire like lightning given form, and the elves were already engaging the enemy, but they were outnumbered 100 to 1. The void machines descended in perfect formation, each one a mirror of the others in wear. They landed the ground, died the grass withering, the trees falling silent, and Jake saw it through. Nethys' eyes saw the hive mind coordinating every movement, and he thought about disruption, thought about chaos, thought about the human way of war. He reached through the bond and touched the reactor controls and sent a pulse. Not the full discharge, but a ripple, and it cascaded through. Nethys and the dragon became a living electromagnetic storm, and everywhere the dragon flew the void coordination shattered and machines fell, twitching to the ground. But there were too many, and they adapted fast, learning from each pulse, and Jake felt the reactor energy draining, felt his own strength failing, and Silvera collapsed mid-battle, and through the link he felt her body rejecting the child, felt her immune system attacking, and Lisa was screaming medical emergency over the communication. Channelcade organized a defensive perimeter around the bonding chamber, and she fought with cold precision, dropping void drones with calculated shots, and Troy was beside her, throwing jury-rigged explosives and shouting coordinates, and the elf warriors formed a circle of shields and singing weapons. Jake felt himself being torn between battles, between the fight in the sky and the fight inside Silvera's body, and he could not be in both places, could not save everything, could not hold all the pieces together, and he was failing. Then Nethys spoke in his mind with a voice like mountains crumbling, and said, "You are trying to control this human, but control is not what is needed. You must surrender to the bond, must become part of it, not master of it." And Jake said, "I do not understand." And the dragon said, "Then learn quickly, because we are running out of time." Lisa had Silvera on an emergency medical platform, and she was working with elf healers, and they were pouring energy into the failing pregnancy, but it was not enough. And the doctor looked at Jake with eyes full of sorrow and said, "We need the full reactor discharge now, or we lose both mother and child." Kate grabbed Jake's shoulder and spun him around, and she said, "If we use the reactor now, the fleet will break through the defense grid, and billions will die, Jake. Billions." And he looked at her and said, "I know." And she said, "Then what do we do?" And he said, "We do the impossible." He dove back into the mental link, dove deeper than before, past the pain, past the fear, into a place where thoughts became reality, and he found Silvera, consciousness fading like a candle in the wind, and he grabbed hold and said, "You do not get to die here. You do not get to give up. We made a promise. Remember, we said we do not die here." Her mind stirred, weak but aware, and she said, "I am trying, Jake. But my body is killing, our child is killing me." And he said, "Then we change your body. We use the bond to rewrite the rejection response." And she said, "That is impossible." And he said, "Humans specialize in impossible." Through Nethys, he reached into Silvera, genetic code into the places where her immune system was attacking the hybrid cells, and he began making changes, guided by Lisa's frantic instructions over the communication link, and he felt the dragon power flowing through him, felt the reactor energy channeling into precision biological warfare. The changes took hold, and Silvera body stopped fighting, stopped rejecting, and the child stabilized, and Lisa was shouting vital signs. Improving pregnancy holding, and Jake felt a surge of triumph. But it cost them all, and the mental link was fraying above them. Nethys was fighting alone against hundreds of void ships, and the dragon was magnificent, was terrible, was dying by inches, because no living thing should channel this much. Power should burn this bright, and Jake felt every wound the dragon took, felt Nethys' life force bleeding away. Pulled himself out of the medical link, and threw everything into the combat link, and suddenly he was seeing through dragon eyes, was feeling the wind under dragon wings, was breathing dragon fire, and the void. Fleet was there in perfect formation, and he thought about patterns, thought about breaking them through Nethys. He released the reactor full discharge, not as a bomb, but as a wave-channeled focus turned into a weapon that no one had ever imagined, and it tore through the void fleet like the hand of an angry god, and ships fell burning, and the hive mind recoiled, screaming in frequencies that hurt to hear the dragon. Fell from the sky, and Jake felt the impact, felt bones breaking, felt the life leaving that ancient powerful body, and he was screaming. No, no, no. But Nethys' mind was fading, and the dragon's last thought was, "Did we win? Did we save them?" Kate was shouting. Confirmed kills, 90% enemy fleet destroyed, remaining ships in retreat. And Troy was laughing, crying, saying, "We did it, we actually did it," but Jake could not celebrate because he was kneeling beside Nethys' broken body, and the dragon was. Not breathing, Silva pulled herself from the medical platform against Lisa. Protests, and she crawled to the dragon, and she laid her hands on Nethys' scales, and she whispered, "Please, please do not leave me. We have been together since I was a child." "You cannot leave," and there was no answer. Only silence. The elves came, and they sang the death songs, and they wept, because a dragon bonded to royalty was sacred, was irreplaceable, and with Nethys' death, the old ways would die too, and Jake sat there, covered in dragon blood, covered in his own blood, and he thought about the price of victory, thought about what they had paid. Days passed in a blur of medical treatment and debriefing, and Jake barely remembered any of it because he was caught between grief for Nethys and fear for Silvera, who was stable but fragile, and the child who lived but might not survive to term Lisa. Gave him the full report in a quiet moment, and she said, "The genetic modifications you made, they worked better then. I could have hoped, and Silvera's body has accepted the pregnancy fully," but she looked troubled, and Jake said, "What else?" And she said, "The child. Oh, DNA contains something we did not expect." She showed him scans and said there are dormant genetic sequences that match neither human nor elf, something ancient, something that might be what both species evolved from, and I do not know what it means, but it could be important. And Jake said, "Or it could be nothing," and Lisa said, "Yes, or it could be nothing." Troy had salvaged what he could from the reactor, and he said, "We are running on emergency power now, Jake. No more big moves, no more miracles, and the Avalon is completely dead. We are stuck here for good, unless the rescue fleet actually comes." And Jake said, "How long?" And Troy said, 3 years if they even got our distress signal. Kate pulled him aside, said, "We need to talk about what comes next, about whether we stay, whether we integrate with the elf society, whether we help them rebuild." And Jake said, "You are asking if I am staying," and she said, "Yes." And he looked toward the medical wing where Silvera was resting and said, "Yes, I am staying." The elf council met, and Jake attended because Silvera insisted, even though he felt like an outsider. And they discussed the victory and the cost and the future, and an old elf with eyes like winter said, "The humans saved us, but at what price? We have lost our greatest dragon, and our queen nearly died." Another said, "But the pregnancy holds, and if the pregnancy holds, and if the child lives, if she proves fertile, then we have hope for the first time in generations, and is that not worth any price?" And the debate raged, but Jake stayed silent because this was not his choice too. Maca Silvera spoke finally, and her voice was weak but clear, and she said, "Nethys chose to sacrifice everything to save us all, and we honor that sacrifice by surviving, by building, by creating the future that the dragon died to protect." And the council fell silent because no one argued with the queen, who had just lost her bonded companion that night, Jake sat with Silvera in her chambers, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and finally she said, "I can still feel the absence where Nethies was like a missing limb, like a hole in my chest," and Jake said, "I know I felt it too through the bond," and she said, "You lost something to that day you lost your dragon before you ever really had one." He took her hand and said, "We are both alive, and the child is alive, and your people have hope in that. Is what Nethies wanted?" And she nodded and said, "Yes, but it still hurts." And he said, "It is supposed to hurt, that is how you know it." Matter days turned into weeks, and Silvera grew stronger, and her pregnancy progressed faster than human standard. And Lisa explained it was an elf trait that evolution had developed for quick population recovery after disasters, and at the accelerated rate they had maybe 2 months before the birth. The elf scientists worked with Lisa and Troy to analyze the victory, to understand how they had won and what it meant, and they discovered that the OID hive mind had been permanently damaged, that the central... Lisa woke Jake in the middle of the night, and her face told him everything before she spoke, and she said, "The baby is failing, Silvera body is rejecting again, but different. This time not immune response, but incompatibility at the cellular level. And we have ours, not days." He ran to the medical bay, still in sleep clothes, and found Silvera pale and trembling, surrounded by machines that hummed and beeped and showed numbers that meant nothing to him, but everything to the healers who looked. Grim and defeated Silva reached for his hand, and her grip was weak, and she said, "I am sorry, Jake. I thought I was strong enough, I thought I could carry her to term, but my body's giving up." And he said, "No, you are the strongest person I know, and we will find a way." Lisa pulled him aside and spoke in the clipped professional tone she used when emotions were too big to let in, and she said, "There is a solution. The ancient elf biotechnology, the regeneration chambers, but they require massive energy input to rewrite genetic code at this scale, and we do not have that kind of power anymore." Troy appeared at the door, and he had been running, and he said, "I have an idea, but you are not going to like it." And Jake said, "Tell me anyway," and Troy said, "The Avalon reactor core is dead, but the shielding system still has residual power enough for one final discharge if we strip it completely." Kate was right behind him, and she cut in and said, "But that shielding is the only thing keeping the reactor from going critical, and if we strip it, the whole wreck becomes a bomb in about 6 hours." And Troy said, "Yes, but those 6 hours are enough to power the regeneration." Chamber Jake felt the pieces clicking into place, and he said, "You want to use the reactor meltdown as a power source." And Kate said, "More than that, the meltdown will create an explosion big enough to take out the void remnant fleet that has been gathering at the system edge, and we solve 2 problems at once." Lisa was shaking her head, and she said, "But the timing has to be perfect. We power the regeneration chamber, drain the shielding, and then we have 6 hours to evacuate everyone within 50 kilometers before the reactor goes critical. And if anything goes wrong, if the chamber takes longer than expected," Troy finished for her and said, "then we all die, Silvera, the baby, all of us. But Jake, it is the only option we have." And he looked at each of them and saw that they knew it was suicide wrapped up as hope, and they were offering it anyway. He went back to Silvera, and he knelt beside her bed, and he told her the plan, and she listened with eyes that held too much pain. And when he finished, she said, "You are asking me to bet both our lives on human engineering? That has already failed once." And he said, "Yes." And she smiled and said, "Then let us do it, because I trust youth." Evacuation. Loading civilians onto transports and moving them beyond the blast radius, and Kate coordinated it all with military precision, and her face showed nothing but... Jake saw her hands shake when she thought no one was looking. Troy and the elf engineers worked to connect the reactor shielding to the regeneration chamber, and it was delicate, dangerous work, and twice they nearly triggered an early meltdown. And Jake watched and felt useless, because this was beyond his skills. Beyond anything but waiting, Lisa prepped Silvera for the chamber, and she explained the process and said, "Your body will be flooded with energy, and it will rewrite the genetic incompatibilities. But the pain will be extreme." And Silvera said, "I have given birth to hope in the middle of a war. I think I can handle pain." They placed her in the chamber, and it was beautiful in a terrible way. All crystal and light and organic curves, and Jake stood outside, the transparent wall and put his hand against it, and Silvera put hers on the other side, and they stayed like that for a moment that felt eternal. Troy started the power transfer, and the reactor shielding began to drain, and numbers on screens counted down, and the chamber filled with light so bright that Jake had to look away. And inside, Silvera was screaming, and he wanted to tear the chamber open, wanted to stop it, but he knew he could not. Lisa monitored everything, and she was talking to herself, running calculations and adjusting variables, and she said, vital signs, critical neural activity spiking, genetic resequencing at 40%, and we are only 10 minutes in, and we need at least an hour. The chamber pulsed, and reality seemed to bend around it. And Jake felt something through the old mental link, felt Silvera agony, felt her determination, felt her love for the child she carried, and he poured everything he had through that connection: strength, hope, stubborn human refusal to quit. 30 minutes in, and the chamber cracked, and alarms screamed, and Troy was there, sealing it with emergency patches, and he said the power flow is too much. The chamber was not designed for this level of energy input, and Lisa said if we reduce power, the resequencing will not complete. And Kate said, how long until reactor critical? And Troy checked and said for our Zan elf healer, pulled Jake aside and said through the observation window, we can see the child, the genetic changes are working, but the queen, her body is breaking down faster than it can repair. And Jake said, what does that mean? And the healer said it means she might save the child, but not survive herself. Jake felt something crack inside him, and he went to the chamber, and he put both hands on the surface, and he shouted over the noise of machines and alarms and said, Govera, you listen to me, you do not get to die. You do not get to save everyone else and leave me here. We are in this together through the fading mental link. He felt her attention turn toward him, and her voice in his mind was weak. And she said, Jake, I am so tired. And he said, I know, but you are almost there, almost done. Just hold on a little longer. And she said, for you, I will try. Lisa said, genetic resequencing at 90%, child vitals, strengthening maternal vitals critical. We are losing her. And Jake said, how long? And she said, minutes, maybe less. And he wanted to scream, wanted to break something, wanted to tear the universe apart. Then Troy shouted and said, I have an idea. And he was already moving, and he said, the dragon egg, the one we have been growing, it is crystalline structure, same as the chamber. And if we connect them, we might be able to stabilize the energy flow. And Kate said, will that work? And Troy said, I have no idea. They brought the egg from the workshop, and it was glowing now, pulsing with its own internal light, and Troy connected it to the chamber with cables and crystal conduits. And the moment the connection was made, everything changed. The egg began absorbing excess energy and channeling it back in a smoother pattern, and the chamber stopped cracking, stopped screaming, and inside Silvera gasped, and her vitals began to stabilize, and Lisa was laughing and crying and saying, it is working, whatever this is. It is working. But the egg was changing, growing at an accelerated rate, and cracks appeared on its surface. And Jake said, what is happening? And an elf bioengineer said, it is hatching. The energy influx is forcing premature development. And Jake said, is that bad? And the engineer said, I do not know. This has never happened before. The egg shattered, and what emerged was small, barely the size of a large dog, but it was unmistakably a dragon with scales that shimmered between crystal and metal, and eyes that burned with familiar intelligence. And it looked at Jake and spoke in his mind, and the voice was Nethi's voice. But younger, uncertain, the young dragon said, I remember dying. I remember falling, but now I am here again. How? And Jake felt tears on his face, and he said, we brought you back. We grew you from what remained. And the dragon said, then I am reborn as you were reborn, and we are bound by more than magic. Now the dragon turned to the chamber where Silvera lay, and it pressed its small body against the crystal, and power flowed between them, dragon and queen reconnecting the bond that death had severed. And Silvera's eyes opened, and she gasped, and the machine showed her vitals spiking upward. Lisa said, genetic resequencing, complete, child stable, maternal condition improving. And she looked at the dragon and said, I do not understand what just happened, but I am not going to question it. And Kate said, "How long until reactor critical?" And Troy said, 90 minutes, and we need to go now. They pulled Silvera from the chamber. And she was weak but alive, and the child inside her was strong, and Lisa did a quick scan and said, "She will make it, they both will." And Jake held Silvera, and she held him and the young. Nethys coiled around them. Both the evacuation ships were waiting. And they loaded everyone on, and Troy set the final timers, and they lifted off, and Jake watched the city fall away below them, the crystal towers that had become home in these impossible months. Kate counted down and said 30 seconds, and they were far enough away, safe enough, and the reactor went critical, and the explosion was like a second sun, and it reached into space and caught the Void Remnant fleet and destroyed them utterly. The shockwave hit, and the ship rocked but held, and when the light faded, there was a crater where the Avalon had been, where the city edge had stood, and Jake felt the loss of it, the price they had paid, but they were alive. Silvera went into labor. 2 weeks later, and it was fast even for accelerated elf. Biology and the healers said the genetic modifications had changed more than just compatibility. They had optimized the entire process. Jake was there holding her hand, and she was squeezing hard, enough to break bones, and she was cursing in 3 languages too, of which he did not know, and he was saying, "You can do this. You are doing this." And she was saying, "I hate you. I love you. This is your fault." And he was laughing through tears. 20 years passed like water through fingers, and Jake stood in the great hall watching his daughter address the combined council of humans and elves, and he felt pride swell in his chest, because hope had grown into everything her name promised. She stood tall with her mother Grace and her father Determination, and beside her coiled a magnificent dragon named Starfire, who was descended from the young Nethys, and their bond was legendary among both peoples. Spoke, and her voice carried the authority of someone born to lead, and she said, "We stand at a crossroads. Our people have recovered. Our numbers grow. Our technology advances, and the void remains at the edge of known space waiting, and we must decide what we do next." Around her sat the council members, both human and elf, and among them were her siblings, because Silvera and Jake had not stopped at one child, and there were 5 more each, unique, each carrying the best of both species. Eldest after Hope was a boy named Sky, who had his father tactical mind and his mother diplomatic skill, and he ran the exploration fleet that mapped new systems and searched for other survivors, other lost colonies. The twins, Maya and River, were scientists who had taken Lisa work and expanded it, and they had developed techniques that allowed full elves to conceive. Again, without human genetic material, and the population was exploding with new births every month. Youngest were Dawn and Ash, barely 15, but already showing signs of greatness, and they trained with Kate, learning both human and elf combat styles, and they dreamed of the day they could fight the void and end the threat. Forever Jake listened as Hope laid out her proposal, and she said, "We have received signals from 3 other systems, distress calls from what appear to be elf remnants, cut off from their homeworlds, and human colonies that lost contact with Earth during the expansion, and we have the capability to help them." Silvera sat beside Jake on the royal dais, and she had barely aged in 20 years because the genetic modifications that saved her life. It slowed her aging, and she would live much longer than any elf had before, and she squeezed his hand and said, "Our daughter wants to leave, wants to explore." And he said, "I know." And she said, "We have to let her go." And he said, "I know that." Tootha council debated for hours, and some wanted to focus on defense, wanted to fortify what they had, and others agreed with Hope that they had a responsibility to help those who were struggling as they once had. Kate stood, and the warrior queen had gray in her hair now, but she was still formidable, and she said, "I trained this generation to fight, but more importantly, I trained them to think and hope. Plan is sound, and we have the resources to support both defense and exploration." Joy agreed, and he said, "The hybrid technology we have developed gives us capabilities that neither species had alone, and we can build ships that combine human durability with elf elegance, and we can travel farther, faster, safer than ever before." Lisa spoke last, and she was old now, truly old, because humans aged faster than elves, and she said, "I have spent 2 decades studying the hybrid genome, and I can tell you with certainty that these children are not just viable, they are superior, and not in arrogance, but in adaptability. Yes. And they can survive in environments that would kill pure humans or pure elves, and that makes them perfect for exploration. The vote was called, and it passed, and Hope would lead the first expedition to contact the other survivors, and her fleet would consist of 3 ships, crewed by hybrid volunteers, and supported by both human and elf technology. Jake found his daughter later in the training grounds where she sparred with Starfire, and the dragon was massive now, easily the size of the old Nethies, and they moved together in perfect synchronization, and it was beautiful to watch. He said, "You are really doing this? You were leaving?" And Hope landed from a complicated aerial maneuver, and she said, "Yes, Father, I have to." And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you taught me that when people need help, you help them, even when it is dangerous, even when it is hard." She continued and said, "You could have left when the rescue fleet came. You could have gone back to Earth, back to safety, but you stayed because these people needed you, and now other people need us, and I am going." And Jake felt his throat tighten, and he said, "I am proud of you, Starfire." Spoke in his mind, and the dragon said, "I will protect her, Jake, as Nethies protected Silvera. As I have protected her since we bonded, and she will do great things." And Jake said, "I know, but she is still my daughter, still my little girl." And the dragon made a sound like gentle laughter. Preparations took 3 months, and the ships were marvels, combining sleek elf design with robust human engineering, and they had weapons that could disrupt void hive minds and shields that could withstand anything short of a direct reactor. Brecht Silvora gave Hope a crystal that contained recorded memories of the war, of the struggle, of the near extinction, and she said, "When you meet other survivors, show them this, show them that we understand what they are going through, and that they are not alone." Jake gave her a data chip with tactical information and survival strategies, and he said, "The universe is dangerous, but you are dangerous to never forget that." And Hope laughed and said, "Very inspiring, Father." And he said, "I am serious." And she said, "I know, and I will remember." The night before departure, the family gathered, and they shared a meal and stories and laughter, and Jake looked around the table at his children, at his wife, at the young Nethies, who was now ancient, Nethies reborn and fully grown, and he thought about how far they had come. Silvara proposed a toast, and she said, 20 years ago we were dying, and then the universe sent us a ship full of stubborn humans who refused to accept that anything was impossible." And she looked at Jake and said, "And one human in particular, who changed everything." Jake felt embarrassed, and he said, "I just did what anyone would have done." And Kate snorted and said, "No, you did what only you would have done, and the rest of us followed because we trusted you." And Lisa added, "And because you were usually right, even when you should not have been." The children wanted to hear the story again, the one about the crash in the first meeting and the proposal, and even though they had heard it 100 times, Jake told it again because some stories never got old. Hope listened with shining eyes, and when he got to the part where Silvera said, "I would carry your child," she said, "I cannot imagine how terrifying that must have been." And Silvera said, "It was the most frightening thing I ever did, but also the most important." The next morning they stood at the spaceport and watched the 3 ships prepare for launch, and there was a crowd because half the city had come to see the first expedition off, and there were elf and human and hybrid faces all mixed together. Hope embraced her parents, and she said, "I will come back, I promise." And Silvera said, "I know you will." And Jake said, "Be safe, be smart, and remember that you carry both our peoples with you." And she said, "I will make you proud." She boarded the flagship, which was named Nethi's Legacy, and Jake watched her go and felt a piece of his heart leave with her. And Silvera leaned against him and said, "This is what we fought for, Jake. This moment when our children are strong enough to go out into the universe and help others." The ships launched, and they burned bright against the sky, and then they were gone. And Jake felt the absence, but also the hope, because this was the future they had built together. A future where hybrid children could explore, could grow, could thrive. Kate came to stand beside them, and she said, "The second wave is already volunteering, and we will need to build more ships." And Troy said, "We have the capacity and the resources." And Lisa said, "And we have the will, and that is what matters most." The weeks turned to months, and Hope sent regular reports, and they found The first survivor group, a colony of humans who had been cut off for 50 years and who had barely survived, and the relief mission was a success, and the colonists wept. When they saw the hybrid crew, the second contact was with an elf remnant on a frozen world, and they were suspicious at first because they did not believe that elves and humans could coexist, could create hybrid children, and Hope showed them Silvera memory crystal, and they watched the recording and they understood the third contact was the hardest because they found a world that had fallen to the void, and they fought to evacuate the few survivors. And Hope lost crew members in the battle, and she sent a message home and said, "War is different when it is people you know when it is friends who die." Jake read the message, and he remembered Atheus falling from the sky, and he knew exactly how his daughter felt, and he sent back a message and said, "Honor them by living, by continuing, by making sure their sacrifice meant something." Silver added her own message and said, "You are doing important work. Hope, and it will hurt, and it will cost, but it is worth it because every person you save is a future that continues." The young ones, Dawn and Ash, wanted to join the second wave, and Jake wanted to say no, wanted to keep them safe. But Silvera said, "We cannot protect them forever, and they are hybrids. They are meant to explore, to fight, to push boundaries," and he knew. She was right. Kate trained the second wave, and she was harder on them than she had been on anyone, and she said, "You are going out there to represent all of us, and you will do it right, or you will not go at all." And they worked until they were ready. The void began to stir again after years of dormancy, and reconnaissance showed they were rebuilding, adapting, learning from their previous defeats. And Kate said, "We need to hit them before they recover fully," and the council agreed.